You will be amazed by the ending of this story. I advise everyone to watch it to the end. Christmas Eve was supposed to feel magical. You know, the kind of night where the air carries this strange sense of calm, like the world's holding its breath before the big day. For Sarah and me, though, it felt off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just this weird heaviness in the air. I kept telling myself it was probably because it was our first Christmas in this house, our first Christmas as a married couple. New place, new traditions, right? I'll admit, I had been distracted most of the evening. Between untangling string lights and trying to keep our cat, Milo, from climbing the tree, I didn't notice anything strange. Not at first. But when I sat down with Sarah to watch It's a Wonderful Life, her favorite Christmas tradition, I caught it. The lights. You know how Christmas lights have this soft, warm glow. The ones on our tree were flickering, just barely. It wasn't the kind of flicker you'd get from a loose bulb or a bad connection. It was more like, they were breathing. Like they had a rhythm. Do you see that? I asked Sarah, keeping my voice steady. She turned her head, frowning. What? I gestured to the tree. The lights. They're, flickering. She squinted, then shook her head. No. Looks fine to me. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat. The second she looked away, the flicker stopped. Just stopped. I told myself I was tired. That had to be it. We'd been up since dawn prepping for tomorrow, and I hadn't eaten much since lunch. Maybe I was just imagining things. But then Milo hissed. He was curled up by the fireplace, his usual spot when we had the logs burning. 1 second, he was dozing, the next, he was on his feet, ears flat, back arched. He stared at the hallway behind the tree, his yellow eyes wide and unblinking. Milo? Sarah called, leaning forward. What's wrong, buddy? I followed his gaze, but there was nothing there. Just the dark hallway leading to the bedrooms. I grabbed my phone to turn on the flashlight, an instinct, I guess, but before I could, Milo bolted. He ran full speed down the hallway, vanishing into the shadows. Okay, that was weird, Sarah said, looking at me. You think he saw something? Maybe a bug, I offered, though even I didn't believe that. Sarah laughed, but it was nervous, forced. Great. Just what I wanted for Christmas, a house full of bugs. I didn't respond. My eyes stayed locked on the hallway. Something wasn't sitting right. You know how sometimes you just feel something? Like you're being watched, even when you're alone. I swear, at that moment, it felt like the hallway was staring back at me. And maybe it's just my imagination, but I could have sworn I heard something. Not a thud or a creak, but this faint scraping sound. Sarah broke the silence. You coming to bed? I blinked and realized she was already standing, stretching her arms over her head. The fire was dying, and the movie was long over. Yeah, just give me a sec, I said, stalling. She didn't push. Don't be too long, okay? I nodded, but my attention drifted back to the hallway. I didn't move until I heard our bedroom door click shut. That's when I grabbed my phone again and turned on the flashlight. I'm not sure what I expected to find, maybe Milo pawing at the baseboards, or some shadow cast by the dying fire. But the hallway was empty. Completely empty. Even Milo was gone. I called his name softly, not wanting to wake Sarah. Milo? Come on, buddy. Where are you? Nothing. I moved a few steps down the hall, shining my light on the walls, the floor, the doors. It wasn't until I reached the guest room at the end of the hall that I found him. He was sitting perfectly still in the middle of the room, staring at the far corner. I hesitated. Something about the way he sat there, it wasn't normal. Milo was a hyper cat. He never sat still for long, especially not like this. Milo, I whispered. What are you doing, man? No reaction. I aimed my flashlight at the corner he was fixated on, and my stomach dropped. There was a smear on the wall. It looked like someone had dragged their fingers through dust, or ash. 5 long streaks ran from the ceiling to the floor, almost perfectly parallel. Milo, come on, I said, louder now. This time, he turned to look at me, his pupils blown wide. And then he bolted again, darting past my legs and disappearing into the living room. My pulse was racing. I knew I should check the wall, but the thought of getting closer to those marks. I just couldn't do it. Not right then. Instead, I backed out of the room, shutting the door behind me. When I got back to the living room, the fire had burned out completely. The air was colder now, and the tree lights were still glowing softly. No flicker, no rhythm. It was like whatever had been messing with them earlier was gone. Or maybe, it wasn't. I sat on the couch for a while, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. I didn't want to wake Sarah over nothing, and I sure as hell didn't want to explain why I was so spooked. It's Christmas Eve, I whispered to myself. Just relax. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And then I heard the whisper. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't clear. Just this faint, almost mechanical sound coming from the direction of the tree. Like static, but not quite. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Was it, the ornaments? No. It was coming from behind the tree. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding, and took a step closer. The whispering stopped. And then the tree lights went out. The tree lights didn't just flicker this time, they cut out completely. 1 second, the room was bathed in that soft, golden glow, and the next, darkness. My reflection stared back at me from the living room window, lit only by the faint glow of my phone screen. The silence was suffocating. Power's fine, I muttered under my breath. The lamp by the couch was still on, and the furnace hummed faintly through the vents. So why did the tree go dark? I thought about calling Sarah, but something stopped me. A feeling I couldn't explain, like waking from a nightmare and being too afraid to say it out loud because somehow, that might make it real. The whisper. That sound, whatever it was, had come from behind the tree. I took a step forward, my socks muffling the creak of the floorboards. My flashlight cast long, jagged shadows on the wall, turning every ornament into something grotesque. I reached out slowly, brushing one of the branches aside to peer behind the tree. And there it was. The outlet where the lights were plugged in. Only, the plug wasn't in the outlet anymore. It lay on the floor, perfectly intact, the prongs clean as if it had been pulled out gently. Deliberately. For a second, I just stared. My brain tried to rationalize it. Milo must have knocked it loose while darting around. But no. He'd been nowhere near the tree. The whisper returned. This time, it was louder. Clearer. It wasn't static. It wasn't wind. It was a voice, low and guttural, like someone choking out words through a throat full of gravel. I dropped the branch and spun around, my flashlight sweeping the room. Who's there? I said, my voice breaking. No answer. Just that whisper, trailing off into silence. I spent the next few minutes pacing the living room, trying to make sense of it. Something about the whole thing felt staged, like it was meant to get my attention. But why? Milo sat perched on the couch now, tail flicking back and forth as he stared at me. You're not gonna tell me what's going on, are you? I muttered. He blinked. I was about to head to bed when I saw them. The footprints. Our living room had these huge windows that looked out onto the front yard. Snow covered everything outside, untouched and pristine, except for a trail of footprints leading up to the house. They weren't there earlier. I was sure of it. I'd looked out the window when we were setting up the tree, and the yard was completely untouched. But now, a single line of footprints cut through the snow, leading directly to the front door. My stomach churned. They weren't mine, and they definitely weren't Sarah's. I leaned closer to the window, squinting to make out the shape of the prints. They looked strange, too narrow, too long, like they belonged to someone who wasn't wearing shoes. Or maybe. I don't know what I was thinking, but my legs moved before my brain could stop me. I grabbed my coat from the chair and stepped outside into the freezing air. The world was eerily quiet. Snow muffled everything, even the sound of my own footsteps crunching as I followed the trail. The prints led away from the front door, weaving through the yard before stopping at the edge of the woods behind the house. I should have turned back. Any sane person would have gone inside, locked the doors, and called it a night. But something about those footprints drew me in. I stepped closer to the tree line, my flashlight sweeping over the snow. And that's when I saw it. The prints didn't stop. They just ended. Right there at the edge of the woods, as if whoever, or whatever, had been walking simply vanished into thin air. The whisper came again. But this time, it was right behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly slipped on the ice. Nothing. The yard was empty. The house stood dark and silent, the warm glow of the living room lamp barely visible through the frosted window. My breath came in shallow gasps, fogging up the air in front of me. I stood there for what felt like hours, scanning the yard, the trees, the footprints. Finally, I forced myself to move. I stumbled back toward the house, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it tight. My heart was racing, and I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing in the snow. "Milo?" I called, my voice cracking. No response. The house felt different now. Heavier, colder, like the walls were pressing in. I grabbed my phone to text Sarah, but the screen was black. Dead. No. Not dead. The battery was fine, but the screen wouldn't respond. It just flickered, this faint glow like static on an old TV. And then it happened. A single word, scrawled across the screen in jagged letters. Run. I nearly dropped the phone. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely hold it. "Sarah!" I yelled, bolting down the hallway to our bedroom. The door was shut, and I pounded on it. "Sarah, wake up. Something's wrong." No answer. I turned the knob and pushed the door open, my breath hitching. The room was empty. The bed was perfectly made, the covers untouched, as if no one had been in it all night. "Sarah?" I whispered, my voice barely audible now. The air in the room was colder than the rest of the house, so cold that I could see my breath. And then I saw it. The closet door. It was open, just a crack. I don't remember crossing the room, but suddenly, I was standing right in front of it. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, my flashlight casting a long, thin beam of light into the dark. I swung the door open. And froze. I wish I could tell you I screamed. That I slammed the closet door shut and ran to wake Sarah. But I didn't. I just stood there, staring. It wasn't what I saw, it was what I didn't see. The closet was empty. No clothes. No boxes. Nothing but the bare wooden floor and walls. Except, that wasn't right. We'd moved into the house 6 months ago, and the closet had been full of Sarah's things, sweaters, scarves, her ridiculous collection of Christmas socks. It should have been packed. But now, it was like the closet had been wiped clean, scrubbed of every trace of us. And then I saw the hole. It was small, maybe the size of a baseball, carved into the back wall. At first, I thought it was just a knot in the wood, but no. It was perfectly round, as if someone had taken a drill to it. The whisper came again. This time, it was coming from the hole. I stepped closer, against every instinct screaming at me to stop. The air near the hole felt colder, sharp, like it was being sucked in. My flashlight beam wavered as my hand shook, the light barely catching the edges of the opening. And then I heard it. A voice. Faint but distinct, like someone speaking just out of earshot. "Help me." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of the bed. My mind raced. The voice was too faint to make out clearly, but I knew what I'd heard. Someone was in the walls. I bolted out of the room and down the hall. "Sarah! Where are you?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty house. No response. I threw open our bedroom door, my heart racing. The bed was perfectly made, untouched. "Sarah?" I called again, this time softer. My voice cracked in the silence. I swore she'd gone to bed hours ago. I'd heard her close the door. But the room was cold, lifeless, like no one had been in it all night. I backed out slowly, glancing toward the living room. And that's when I heard it. "Jake." The sound of her voice nearly made me jump out of my skin. I spun around and found her standing in the hallway, rubbing her eyes. She looked confused, her hair tousled from sleep. "What are you doing?" she asked. I stared at her, trying to process what I was seeing. Where were you?" "In bed," she said, frowning. "I heard you yelling, and when I came out, you were just standing here." "No," I said, shaking my head. "I checked the bedroom." "You weren't there." "Jake, I was there," she insisted. Her voice was calm, steady, like she was trying to soothe me. But her eyes didn't look calm. They darted toward the guest room, just for a second, before she forced a smile. "You're scaring me. Are you okay?" I wanted to argue, to tell her about the whispering, the footprints, the reflection in the tree. But the words felt stuck in my throat, like saying them would make it worse. I didn't sleep that night. Sarah fell back into bed without a second thought, pulling the blankets up to her chin like nothing had happened. I sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the guest room door down the hall. Something had changed in the house. I couldn't explain it, but it wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was real. The footprints. The whispering. The smear on the wall that had turned into a handprint. And then there was Sarah. She acted normal, sure, but there was something off about her. I told myself I was imagining it, that my nerves were shot from everything that had happened. But the way she looked at me. Her eyes didn't match her voice. Around 3 a.m., I decided I couldn't sit there anymore. I needed to do something, anything, to make sense of what was happening. The first thing I did was check my phone. It was still glitching, the screen flickering faintly, but this time, I noticed something new. A notification. It was an incoming call. The screen displayed a number I didn't recognize, just a string of zeros, like something out of a bad horror movie. My thumb hovered over the answer button, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know why I answered it. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. At first, there was nothing. Just silence. And then. "Jake." The voice sent a chill down my spine. It was quiet, crackling, like it was coming from a radio buried under layers of static. But it wasn't the voice itself that scared me. It was that it sounded like Sarah. But Sarah was asleep, wasn't she? I whipped around to look at her. She hadn't moved, her breathing slow and steady. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear. "Who is this?" I hissed. The voice didn't answer. Instead, I heard something else, faint, rhythmic, like the sound of someone tapping on glass. No, not tapping. Knocking. I hung up and tossed the phone onto the nightstand like it had burned me. My breathing was ragged, my hands trembling. That's when I heard it for real. The knock. It came from the bedroom window, slow and deliberate. 3 sharp taps, evenly spaced. Knock. 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 My stomach clenched. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of the frost-covered glass behind them. Whatever was out there wasn't moving. I turned to Sarah, shaking her shoulder. Sarah. Sarah, wake up. She groaned and rolled over, pulling the blanket over her head. Go to sleep, Jake. It's nothing. Nothing. Did you not hear that? She didn't answer. Knock. 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 This time, it was louder. More insistent. Fine, I muttered, standing up. I moved toward the window, my heart hammering in my chest. My flashlight was still on the nightstand, but I didn't grab it. I didn't want to. Some irrational part of me thought that if I stayed in the dark, whatever was out there couldn't see me. I reached for the curtain, my fingers brushing the fabric. The knocking stopped. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. My breath fogged up the cold glass as I leaned closer. And then, through the frost, I saw it. A face. It was pressed up against the glass, the skin pale and waxy, almost translucent. The eyes were wide and black, as if they had no whites, and the mouth hung open in an unnatural way, like its jaw was dislocated. I stumbled back, crashing into the nightstand. My flashlight toppled to the floor, and Sarah bolted upright in bed. Jake, what the hell, she snapped. There's someone out there. I shouted, pointing at the window. She frowned, squinting in the dark. What are you talking about? There's nothing there. Yes, there is. I saw it. She sighed, rubbing her temples. Jake, I'm not doing this with you tonight. You're freaking me out. Just, come to bed. I turned back to the window. The face was gone. But the frost where it had been. It was still there. And now, there were streaks, 5 long lines running down the glass, as if someone had dragged their fingers across it. I couldn't sleep after that. I paced the house, checking every door and window, making sure they were locked. Sarah stayed in bed, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The whispering hadn't come back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. That if I let my guard down, even for a second, I'd see that face again. Around 4 a.m., I found myself standing outside the guest room. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to see the darkness inside. I hadn't opened it. Slowly, I pushed the door open, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The room was empty, the air cold and stale. But the handprint on the wall. It was gone. In its place was something else, a hole, identical to the one I'd seen in the closet. Small, round, carved into the wall at eye level. The whisper came again, faint and distorted. Help me. I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Who was in the walls? Why were they asking for help? And then, as I crouched down to look into the hole, I saw it. An eye. It blinked. And then, slowly, it started to smile. I staggered back, my heart pounding in my chest. That thing, whatever it was, had been looking at me. Watching me. The grin was burned into my mind, impossibly wide, full of jagged teeth that didn't belong in any human mouth. I slammed the guest room door shut and pressed my back against it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My flashlight shook in my hands as I aimed it at the floor, half expecting the shadow under the door to shift, to grow, to move. But nothing happened. At least, not at first. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. A minute? 10. Time felt meaningless. And then I heard it. A soft scratching sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from behind the door. It wasn't frantic, like nails on a chalkboard. It was slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, was dragging their fingers across the wood. I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself to move, but my body refused to listen. The scratching stopped. And then I heard it. A knock. 3 sharp taps, echoing through the silence. Knock. 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 I jumped away from the door, nearly tripping over my own feet. The flashlight beam wavered as I aimed it at the door, my mind racing. Sarah! I shouted, my voice cracking. Sarah, wake up! No response. I turned and bolted down the hallway, my feet slipping on the hardwood floor. The house felt wrong, heavier somehow, like the walls were closing in. I burst into the bedroom and flicked on the light. Sarah! She was gone. The bed was empty, the blankets thrown aside like she'd gotten up in a hurry. Sarah! I whispered, panic rising in my chest. And then I heard her. Jake, help me. Her voice was faint, distant, like it was coming from somewhere deep in the house. I followed the sound, my flashlight guiding me through the dark. It wasn't coming from the guest room or the living room. It was coming from somewhere lower, beneath the house. The crawl space. We'd barely used it since moving in. It was one of those creepy little doors tucked into the side of the laundry room, just big enough to squeeze through if you got on your hands and knees. The door was open now. It had been shut when I checked the house earlier. I was sure of it. Sarah! I called, stepping closer. The whisper came again, louder this time. Jake, please. The flashlight beam caught the edge of the crawlspace, illuminating the darkness beyond. The smell hit me first, damp and earthy, like rotting wood. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to move closer. Sarah! I whispered again. No response. I crouched down, shining the light into the crawlspace. It stretched on for what felt like forever, the narrow passage lined with dirt and exposed beams. And then I saw them. Footprints. They were faint, but they were there, small, bare, leading deeper into the darkness. I hesitated, my mind screaming at me to turn back, to wake up from whatever nightmare this was. But I couldn't leave her. I dropped to my hands and knees and crawled inside. The air was colder in the crawlspace, thick and heavy. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, the beam bouncing off the uneven walls. Sarah! I called, my voice trembling. The whisper came again, closer now. Jake, this way. The footprints led me deeper, the dirt soft beneath my hands. My knees ached, and the ceiling seemed to press lower the farther I went. I tried not to think about how tight the space was or how much dirt was above me. Then, my flashlight flickered. No, 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 I muttered, shaking it. The beam steadied, but it was weaker now, dimmer. That's when I saw the door. It shouldn't have been there. The crawlspace was supposed to be a straight shot from one side of the house to the other. But here, deep in the darkness, was a small wooden door, warped with age. I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling. Sarah! I whispered. The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, from behind the door, I heard it. Knock. 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 I wanted to run. God, I wanted to run. But something about the knocking, it wasn't random. It felt like it was waiting for me. Sarah, if you're in there, I'm coming, I said, my voice barely audible. I grabbed the handle and pulled. The door creaked open, revealing a room that shouldn't have existed. It was small, no bigger than a closet, with dirt walls and a low ceiling. In the center of the room was a single wooden chair. And sitting in the chair was Sarah. Sarah! I shouted, crawling inside. She didn't move. Her head was bowed, her hair falling over her face. Her hands rested on the arms of the chair, limp and pale. I scrambled to my feet, reaching out to touch her shoulder. "Sarah, it's me. I'm here." Her head snapped up. And that's when I realized it wasn't her. The thing in the chair looked like Sarah, almost. But her eyes were wrong. Too wide, too dark, with no whites at all. And her mouth, it stretched into that same impossible grin I'd seen through the hole in the guest room. "Jake," she whispered, her voice distorted, layered with something deeper, something inhuman. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "You're not Sarah," I said, my voice trembling. She, or it, stood up slowly, her movements jerky and unnatural. "Jake, don't you love me?" she said, her head tilting at an unnatural angle. "Where is she?" I shouted. "What did you do to her?" The thing grinned wider. "She's here." It raised a hand, pointing past me. I turned, and for the briefest second, I saw something in the darkness, another face, watching me from the shadows beyond the crawlspace. And then the flashlight went out. When the flashlight died, the darkness swallowed everything. I froze, my breath loud in the suffocating silence. I wanted to move, to run, but my body wouldn't listen. I was trapped between the thing behind me, the thing wearing Sarah's face, and whatever was watching from the shadows ahead. "Jake," the distorted voice whispered behind me, so close I could feel the icy breath on my neck. I lunged forward blindly, my hands scraping against the dirt as I scrambled out of the tiny room. My head smacked against the low ceiling, but I didn't stop. I just kept crawling, desperate to get away. Behind me, the whispers grew louder, layered voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. They weren't calling my name anymore. They were laughing. And then I heard something else. Milo. His frantic meowing echoed through the crawlspace, sharp and terrified. "Milo!" I shouted, my voice breaking. I twisted toward the sound, my phone's faint glow catching the glint of his yellow eyes in the distance. He was crouched at the far edge of the crawlspace, his fur puffed up, his body trembling. "Milo, come here, buddy." I called, but he didn't move. He just stared past me, his eyes locked on something in the shadows. That's when I felt it. A hand brushed against my ankle. I don't know how I got out. 1 second, I was crawling toward Milo, and the next, I was pulling myself out of the crawlspace and into the laundry room, clutching the cat to my chest. Milo was shaking, his claws digging into my arm, but I didn't care. I slammed the crawlspace door shut and shoved a heavy toolbox against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Milo, it's okay," I whispered, stroking his fur even though I knew it wasn't okay. Nothing about this was okay. The house was silent again, but it wasn't the kind of silence that made you feel safe. It was the kind that made your skin crawl, the kind that told you something was watching. "Sarah," I muttered, standing up. I stumbled through the house, holding Milo tightly as I checked every room. But Sarah wasn't there. The bedroom was empty, the guest room untouched, the living room exactly as we'd left it, except for the Christmas tree. The lights were on again, flickering softly. And under the tree, there was a box. I stared at it, my chest tightening. We hadn't put any presents under the tree yet, but there it was, a single, perfectly wrapped gift, covered in red paper and tied with a green bow. Milo growled low in his throat, his ears flattening as he squirmed in my arms. "Shoo, buddy," I whispered, trying to steady him. But even as I said it, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I stepped closer to the box, my hands trembling. It was small, no bigger than a shoebox, and perfectly placed in the center of the tree skirt. I didn't want to touch it, but something about it demanded my attention. "Sarah?" I called out, my voice cracking. No answer. I crouched down, Milo hissing in my arms as I reached for the box. The air around it felt colder, heavier, like the room itself was holding its breath. The lid popped open on its own. Milo leapt from my arms with a yowl, darting across the room and vanishing into the hallway. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. A hand emerged from the box, long and pale, with fingers that stretched too far. It gripped the edge, pulling the rest of the body out. It wasn't human. It was small and hunched, like a child, but its proportions were all wrong. Its skin was tight and gray, its head too large, its eyes black and bottomless. It smiled at me. "Leaving so soon?" it rasped. I don't remember screaming. I don't remember running. All I know is that I was suddenly outside, the snow biting at my bare feet as I clutched Milo to my chest. The neighbors found me hours later, sitting on their porch, shivering and clutching Milo like my life depended on it. I babbled about Sarah, about the thing in the house, but no one believed me. The police came. They searched the house. They found nothing. No crawlspace door. No handprints. No box. But they found her purse. It was sitting on the kitchen counter, untouched, next to her phone. Her keys were still in the bowl by the door. And her shoes? Still by the front door. There was no way she could have left on her own. The search lasted for weeks. The police questioned me over and over, but I had no answers to give. How could I explain what had happened? Eventually, the search stopped. Sarah became another missing person on a long list of unsolved cases. And me? I never went back to that house. Sometimes I dream about her. In the dream, she's standing by the tree, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes wide and empty. She doesn't speak, but I can hear her voice, faint and distorted, calling out to me from somewhere far away. "Jake, help me." I always wake up shaking, Milo curled tightly against my side. And every Christmas Eve, without fail, I hear it, the whispering. It doesn't matter where I am, or how loud I play the TV. It always finds me. So now, every year, I leave a single present under the tree. Wrapped in red paper, tied with a green bow. Just in case.